To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod.
Welcome to the Death Panel. Patrons, thank you so much for supporting the show. None of the work that we do would be possible without you. To become a supporter of the show and get access to the second weekly bonus episode, as well as the entire back catalog of bonus episodes, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. And to help us out some more, share the show with your friends, post about your favorite episodes, pick up copies of Health Communism, A Short History of Trans Misogyny, and Abolish Rent at your local bookstore, or request them at your local library, and follow us at deathpanel_. I'm Beatrice Adler-Bolton, and today I'm honored to be joined by longtime friend of the panel, but first-time guest, Ayesha Siddiqi. Ayesha is a brilliant writer, editor, and strategist. Her writing often focuses its analysis on cultural, political, and social phenomena. Ayesha was editor-in-chief of The New Inquiry and co-authored the Rhetorical Software Manifesto. She's currently working on a history of the aughts and publishes incisive culture and pop culture writing on her Substack. And I've asked her on today to talk about an essay that she recently put out on Substack called Late Empire Life Extension. Ayesha, welcome to the Death Panel. It's so great to finally have you on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. I'm really excited to get the chance to just talk about this essay. It's a very fun read. It's very historically precise. It also just meshes so well with the work that we've done, especially over the last 2 years here at Death Panel, particularly the end of year episode that we just recently unlocked a couple weeks ago called Health Fascism and the Anti-State State. You know, we spend a lot of time on the show talking through how contemporary regimes of biopolitical control, from healthcare, other care economies, to wellness, to policy, law, rhetoric, all function at the level of political economy, social discipline, and death-making. And I think Late Empire Life Extension is a really fantastic essay that is directly speaking to the same focus. You take aim at anti-aging, at wellness, biohacking, optimization, and just general longevity culture. And you take it really seriously as a core formation of empire. I think it's too easy to just kind of laugh this stuff off as like quirky conspiracies or exploitative consumer trends. But it's actually much more sinister and complicated than that, as you argue in your essay and as we're going to talk about today. And this conversation feels especially urgent right now. We've had some of the biggest names in longevity medicine as part of the recent Epstein leaks. Recent reporting by Politico showed that RFK Jr., the current head of Trump's Department of Health and Human Services, is pushing what's being described as a federally funded Fountain of Youth moonshot initiative, where they're going to be pursuing research into the lymphatic system, wearables, apps, and the use of psychedelics to quote-unquote reverse aging. Now, the project is being spearheaded by someone named Alicia Jackson, who is the current director of the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, who says that beyond extending lives, success would mean saving lots of money. You're very clear in your argument, Ayesha, that this obsession with extending life, with preserving youth, or portraying youth and control over the body, which right now is in this moment of incredible mainstream focus and popularity, is a really key dynamic of managing the population during this period of politics. And that it has also a larger historical meaning beyond this specific moment that is really worth paying attention to. Because what all this does is ultimately just narrow the category of the livable, the valuable, and the worth saving at a moment when mass death is becoming largely structurally unavoidable. As you write in the essay, quote, obsession with anti-aging emerges alongside the pursuit of conquest, steeply growing inequality, and the mainstreaming of bigotry through new media. When death is cheaply tolerated, no one's life is spared the devaluation. Aging and death are the great equalizers. As the contours of inequality grow, especially brutal, anti-aging focused wellness movements offer a theater of exception. So, with all that said, just to start us off here, I want to give listeners who haven't read the essay, again called Late Empire Life Extension, a way into the piece before we get too deep in the weeds. So, Ayesha, to start us off, can you walk us through the core thesis of your essay just in brief? What are you trying to name about this moment, specifically with regard to connections that you're drawing between a kind of focus on anti-aging and longevity and wellness and a kind of anxiety of empire?
Sure. So the modern polycrisis, which includes environmental, political, and social instability, has now reached a point of expansion enough so that it's no longer felt exclusively at the margins. It's visible across class. And anti-aging protocols have emerged as a cope for imperial decline, for Western decline, but they're also an accelerant for that decline because of how the fixation on anti-aging as wellness propagandizes people into right-wing patterns of thought and behavior. In my essay, I detailed how the 19th century Europeans that became the Nazis were led to fascism through wellness protocols in much of the same ways that Americans are being led right now. The reason for this, as I argue, is that it's a highly potent salve for feelings of helplessness, overwhelm, and status decline. Contemporary white Americans are especially disposed to logic that recoups feelings of belonging, control, and superiority because they're used to those feelings. And key pillars of the modern wellness movement have direct analogs to the turn of the century. They emerged out of economic precarity, imperial conquest, and the instability of white and upper middle class identity formation. I was motivated to share this essay because the late 19th and early 20th centuries are not only a case study in parallels, they're also a warning for the genocide that follows. The violent fascism of European nation building that colonized the world culminated in a Holocaust within Europe's borders. But before it did, many were turning to detoxes, clean eating, and exercise regimens. The Lebensreform or life reform movement that was popular across German-speaking Europe is what gave us almond milk and muesli. But just about every modern idiosyncrasy of wellness has its equivalent at the turn of the century too. So within the time period between the height of colonialism, around the end of the 1800s and before World War II, so the early decades of the 1900s, feature striking similarities to struggles of equality and the backlash to it that we've recently experienced over the last 2 decades. Some of the analogs I cover in my essay include medical influencers, such as the enterprising Dr. John Brinkley of Kansas, who in 1923 was a prototypical content creating medical influencer. He established a radio station to advertise his work. On that station, he broadcast Christian sermons, music, but also critiques of the medical establishment. And to ameliorate the ways that he argued the medical establishment was failing the public, he advertised goat glands and human glands. Gland transplants were at the time considered a legitimate technology of longevity medicine and an important anti-aging remedy. So to give some perspective into how successful this man was, the goat glands were about $750 and the human glands were $2,000. And by the time that the Kansas Medical Board revoked his license, he had already become a millionaire. These biomedical interventions, which were very popular at the time, even Sigmund Freud and William Butler Yeats subjected themselves to these transplants. And Yeats even credited some of his best work to this transplant. He called it his strange second puberty. But these biomedical interventions, they can be compared to the contemporary longevity movement being pushed by tech millionaires, which also favors biomedical intervention, also of dubious origin. And more down market, the rise of aesthetic medicine and beauty protocols with an increasingly intense fixation on anti-aging euphemized as healthy aging. And I understand that people might think, well, haven't we always wanted to pursue youth? Hasn't anti-aging always been relevant to humans across the world? And that's not actually true. The conflation of beauty with youth and the specific association of aging with physical decline rather than wisdom, these really bookend the history of the West. They emerged during the formation of what we now consider the Western world, and they've reemerged in the decline of the Western world.
Can you talk a little bit about why wellness and longevity obsessions really intensify specifically during moments of imperial crisis or social breakdown? I know you just touched on that a little bit. And can you talk about what political and psychic function these kind of personal quests for longevity serve? You know, one of the things that comes to mind is, I mentioned at the top, you know, there was like a huge longevity grifter doctor that was part of the most recent Epstein links. I was talking about Peter Attia, and he's so funny because he kind of sounds like your gland doctor, right? He like has a loyal podcast following. He sells premium memberships to get his medical advice. He never actually finished his medical residency. He went basically straight into, you know, working a job for McKinsey and Company. You know, kind of just typical wellness grifter, right? Mm-hmm. But one of the things that he says, and he tries to like differentiate himself, is he's like, I'm not about wellness medicine. I'm not about longevity. He says, quote, longevity is such a bastardized term. It sort of smells of snake oil and elixirs and, you know, false promises. What I don't think gets enough attention is health span, end quote. So yeah, can you just sort of talk about the sort of psychic function, the political function, and why you argue this is a kind of formula for a moment when these obsessions would intensify, right? That this has a lot to do with the empire being in a state of crisis.
Absolutely. When institutions are insufficiently meeting the needs of the public and they undermine their own credibility in their inability to meet those needs, it creates a massive opportunity for those without those institutional credentials to emerge as authentic voices that can fill that vacuum. And this particular doctor you just mentioned, you're right that he's among the many examples of content creating medical influencers that have grown popular in recent years because they're filling a vacuum that was initially created by the establishment. And it's so ironic that he rejects the term longevity medicine in favor of something that feels more specific to him, health span, when health span, aka years of healthy living, the number of years you spend in a state of health, is how longevity medicine is defined.
Mm-hmm.
So it's an exercise of branding, right, which is very unique to this genre of healthcare figure, which is the medical influencer. And like I mentioned earlier, these are the types of figures that also emerged during the initial anti-aging panic, which was likewise very encouraging to people who wanted to make money in this opportunity they identified of answering people's anxiety around their youth and vigor and vitality. And those anxieties really emerged out of a sense of widespread, not just economic precarity, but a challenge to traditional routes of identity formation. I want to share a quote from one of the books I cite in my essay, which is The Cult of Health and Beauty in Germany, a Social History. In it, the author Michael Howe details how much reactionary conservatism was reinstituted in a changing world under the banner of health and wellness. And what's interesting is that before really laying the ideological groundwork for Nazi concepts of racial cleansing and territorial expansion, it offered immediate succor to the public. It was very central to how people accessed feeling good in the life they felt available to them. Howe writes, quote, "The experience of personal failure, or perhaps more important, simply the fear of it, underpinned the obsession with health. With its promise to increase people's," and he uses a German word here that means the sense of ability to perform and achieve, life reform gave its supporters a sense of agency in their own future. So this ability to develop a sense of agency in your future, it's a way to cope with the status anxiety that's produced during heightened inequality. He also writes, quote, "Lower middle class life reformers were unable to build their social identity around material success or educational attainment. In their quest for social distinction, they therefore made it a virtue out of necessity and turned to bodily discipline." And I think that really articulates just as well the reason why modern people are turning to wellness as a way to ensure future health. It's also a way to access agency in the present.
Mm-hmm. One thing that I think is important to consider here too is that while this kind of way of evaluating like who a valuable person is, for example, based on how many healthy years they live and the kind of internalization of that, while that is definitely the purview of wellness grifters and of this entire sort of longevity industry, it's also, official qualitative policy, right? I don't know if you are familiar with the terms QALY and DALY, which QALY stands for quality adjusted life years and DALY stands for disability adjusted life years. And these are used as sort of a formulaic way in policy and in evaluating like the efficacy of a medication, for example, of creating a quantitative measurement of how much something contributes to a measurable health gain, for example, or years lived in good health, or DALY measures health loss, right? Healthy years lost to disease, healthy years lost to disability, premature death, etc. So these are used for comparing treatments, for assessing chronic diseases, for measuring quality of life improvements, for comparing the burden of different diseases and assessing public health interventions, but also for allocating resources in limited resource, or in resource constrained situations, right? So basically, this is an official, it's an informal way of thinking about the body through wellness industries that is sort of massified that way. But it's also something that totally shapes the entire policy and health and pharmaceutical apparatus that is the kind of official medical industrial complex, is the official pharmaceutical industry, is the official sort of in the clinic care versus the, QVC care of wellness grifters, right? And so you have these two ideas of quali and dali, these opposing sort of quantitative measures of a good life, of a healthy body and years lived healthily. And these are used in cost benefit analysis and cost effective analysis. And so we're also living in this moment where for decades, these have been hugely influential on how health policy has sort of developed over the years and how public health has developed over the years. And, it was first proposed in the late 60s and sort of developed in the 70s. And then in the 80s, it sort of becomes more embedded within the state, right? So it's used to assess medical devices. It's used to assess, medical interventions and pharmaceuticals. But essentially, the sort of health state, to put it, in a kind of concrete way, the health state runs on these very same judgments about what a good life is and what a healthy body looks like, and sorts people according to value based on these allegedly sort of neutral quantitative measurements of who has more health years and who has less health years, so to speak. So, that's one thing I just sort of want to bring in here because, it's no surprise to me to see these things flourishing within and without the state, right? We're in a moment of heightened austerity. We're living through, years and years of welfare reform. And so one of the things that I just wanted to bring in there is kind of the way that while this is a huge dynamic in a kind of consumer market, right, it's also structurally embedded into the state. And I think that way that it's embedded into the state offers, frankly, some legitimacy to the kind of consumer-facing wellness industries.
Absolutely. They're mutually reinforcing. And I'm so glad you bring that up because every priority expressed by an industry is a treatise on what is valued, particularly the medical field, right? And the mandates of policy, those are choices on what and who is valued, and they permeate the culture and train all of us within that culture to make choices and judgments in our own lives in accordance with what policy mandates determine is possible and available. And I had a very interesting message from a geriatrician and palliative medicine physician who read my piece and wrote to say that he had been himself witnessing a real tension in the field of palliative medicine, that this focus on longevity and anti-aging feels like, and his quote was, a geriatrics capitalist doppelganger, because it's taken on so much cachet within the field. But also, I would say this trend of longevity medicine, it's a Trojan horse for decreasing investment in care for the elderly.
Mm-hmm. What you were saying about the longevity trend being a Trojan horse for withdrawing care from elders reminds me so much of, the early months of COVID. There were, a lot of statements made by a bunch of different people. And so some of these more outrageous things that were said back then, I feel have gotten lost, right? We've done a lot of forced forgetting with COVID. COVID has moved very fast as the years have proceeded. We've just seen more and more layers of abandonment and neglect and dismissal and devaluation of human life. So it's easy to sort of forget some of the original takes, right? But one of the original takes that was March 2020 was the Texas Lieutenant Governor, Dan Patrick, was on Tucker Carlson's show on Fox News and basically said grandparents would be totally fine sacrificing themselves to save America and preserve their grandchildren's economic future. The exact quote was, Quote, no one reached out to me and said, as a senior citizen, are you willing to take a chance on your survival in exchange for keeping the America that all America loves for your children and grandchildren? And if that's the exchange, I'm all in, right?
So funny because it's generating this illusion of justifiable sacrifice for a national project, which is meant to like pretend that there is a coherent national project of preserving anyone, let alone the future generations. And in casting this group as expendable, it's just a recommitment to this view that people are expendable in the first place, right? And that's not a concept that you can contain. There is a widespread awareness that there is an expendability to human life in the United States. And many people, including those that I describe in my essay as having turned to the personal routine model of health, it's a way of convincing themselves that there's a possibility of exempting yourself from that expendability. When the harsh truth, or really rather just the basic truth, is that it's something that I think you've said many times, either we're all safe or no one's safe. Either we're all valued or no one is. And that's why I call the anti-aging panic a theater of exception, because that is what it is. That's what it's psychologically performing for people. When you live in a society that is reliant on mass, often racialized violence, you have to enact these rehearsals of self-value to pretend that there's a route available to you to continue participating within the society, to continue existing, and that there is a functionality present.
To hear the full episode, become a patron at patreon.com/deathpanelpod. You'll get access to this and the rest of our catalog of patron-only episodes, and be the first to get a new patron episode every Monday when it drops. With love, the Death Panel.